Okay, hello Cloud Gurus, and welcome to this section of the course. In this section of the course, we're going to look at all the different databases available to us on AWS, and it does come up an awful lot in your exams. I think it's helpful just to start with what a database is. I'm sure you all know, but just in case you don't. And if we think of relational databases, let's start there. So relational databases are what most of us are all used to. They've been around since the 1970s. I want you to think of a traditional spreadsheet. So if you use Excel, Excel is saved in a file. It might be your cost.xls or something like that. So that's essentially the database itself. And then if you go into that file, you've got different worksheets, and those are different tables. And inside your tables, you've got rows and you've got columns or fields. So that's all a database is. And here's a good example of one. Let's say this is a student database. You want a list of all your students in a particular class. You've got your student ID off to the left, and this could be a unique number. And then we've got our first name, our surnames, and then what gender the students are. So that's all a relational database is. Very, very simple. And databases on AWS come in 6 different flavors. So we've got Microsoft SQL Server, we have Oracle, we have MySQL Server, we have PostgreSQL, we have Aurora, which is Amazon's own proprietary database, and we also have MariaDB. So these are the 6 different relational databases on AWS. Now the one that we'll be using in this course will be MySQL, and the reason for that is we're going to be using WordPress to do an installation, and we'll look at doing that in the very next lecture. So the main thing you need to understand about RDS, or Relational Database Services, is it has 2 key features. We've got multi-AZ, which is for disaster recovery, and then we've got read replicas, which is for performance. So multi-AZ, disaster recovery, read replicas, performance. And you will get all these different scenario questions, and it will be asking you if you should be turning on multi-AZ or whether you should be using read replicas. And really, it's all about whether or not you just want to spread your databases across multiple availability zones, then you want multi-AZ. Whereas if you're trying to boost the database's performance, you're going to go for read replicas. And the way it works is we've got a diagram here. So we've got our EC2 instance up the top, and it connects into our databases using a connection string. And we'll have a look at those in the next lab. But essentially, it's using an address. It's a DNS address. So this is an example. So we've got my example DB, and then this is the address, uswest2.rds.amazon.com. So it's connecting to that. Amazon hosts this DNS record, and they point it at a database, a primary database. They point it at its internal IP address. Now, if for some reason we lost our primary, Amazon would detect that, and they'd automatically update the DNS to point to the secondary. So you don't need to go in and change IP addresses or anything like that on the fly. All you're doing is pointing it to this DNS address, and Amazon will go in and update that DNS address with the new IP address. So failover is automatic with multi-AZ. Now with read replicas, it's slightly different. We've got our EC2 instances, and they're pointing off to our primary instance using this connection string. And what happens is that every time you do a write to that database, that write is going to be replicated to another database. It's a perfect copy of the other database, but it's a replica. Now, if you were to lose your primary database for whatever reason, there's no automatic failover from one to the other. What you would have to do is you'd have to go in and essentially create a new URL. And then you'd have to update your EC2 instances to point to the read replica. So where it is useful, however, is if you've got these EC2 instances, let's say you're running a very popular WordPress blog, and most of WordPress is read because people are reading your blog, right? And let's say that your primary database is getting way too many reads because you're getting, let's say a blog goes viral and you start getting 1 million requests per hour. The way you can scale your database is to have a perfect copy of it, a read replica, and you can point half of your EC2 instances to read from the read replica, and then the other half to read from the primary database, and you can scale out that way. So that's what read replicas are, and you can actually have 5 copies of read replicas. Now we are going to cover this in a lot more detail in some lectures and labs coming up, so we'll move on from there. Non-relational databases is probably something you may or may not be familiar with. I certainly wasn't familiar with it until around 2008, 2009. But they basically consist of a collection, and a collection is just a table. And inside the collection, you have documents, and your documents is simply a row. And then you have key value pairs, and these are basically your fields or columns. So let's have a look at what a non-relational database would look like. So something like this. This is just JavaScript object notation language. So in here, we've got our ID as a key value pair, our first name, our surname, our age. Then we've got our address, and we can actually nest key value pairs inside this address. And what's really cool about this is I could go in and say this is record 1. I could go in and then add a new field in here. I could actually go in and add, let's say, gender, for example. So do something like this. So we go from one record which doesn't have someone's gender and the other record which does. Now, if I was to do this in a relational database, let's have a look at my relational database here. If I was to add a new field, the problem I have is that new field is added across all my records. So I've added a new column in, and suddenly I'm missing data for Ryan, I'm missing data for John, I'm missing data for Danielle, but I've got data for Julia. So that's the difference between non-relational and relational databases. You can have as many different columns as you want for any given row within a non-relational database. But for relational databases, you basically have to keep some kind of consistency across all the records. Moving on to data warehousing. So what is data warehousing? Well, basically it's used for business intelligence. So tools like Cognos, Jaspersoft, SQL Server reporting services, Oracle Hyperion, SAP NetWeaver, etc., etc. And it's used to pull in very large and complex data sets, and usually used by management to do queries on data such as current performance versus targets, etc. So before we look at Amazon's solution to data warehousing, I just want to compare online transaction processing versus online analytics processing. So online transaction processing differs from online analytics processing in terms of the types of queries that you run. So let's look at an online transaction processing example, or OLTP example. So say I want to find a specific order. Say it's 2120121. So I basically run a query saying, hey, select order number 2120121. And this is going to pull up a row of data. And this might have things like my name, my date, my address to deliver to, the delivery status, etc. Online analytics processing is going to be much more complicated. So say I'm a manager and I want to understand the net profit for EMEA, so Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and Pacific for the digital radio product. And so this is going to pull in a huge number of records. It's going to do a huge number of queries. So it's basically going to add up the sum of all radios sold in EMEA. It's going to add up all the sums of radios sold in the Pacific. It's going to figure out the unit cost of the radio in each region, and then it's going to take the sales price of each radio, and then it's also going to need to figure out the difference between the sales price and the unit cost. And essentially, it's going to run a whole bunch of queries onto my database. And you really want to start splitting out your, a database that you're going to be using for just normal transactions for your website. And you want a different database for ones that you're going to run queries on, where it's, online analytics processing, where you're running all these very complicated queries. So data warehousing databases use different types of architecture, both from a database perspective and from an infrastructure layer. And so Amazon have a specific product for this called Redshift. So Redshift is Amazon's data warehousing solution. It's Amazon's answer to doing online analytics processing. Moving on to Elasticache. Elasticache is a web service that makes it easy to deploy, operate, and scale an in-memory caching service in the cloud. And this basically improves the performance of your web applications by allowing you to retrieve information from fast managed in-memory caches instead of relying entirely on slower disk-based databases. So what does that mean? Well, again, we're going to do a deep dive lecture on this, but essentially imagine you own Amazon.com. Wouldn't we all like to own Amazon.com? When people visit Amazon.com, they might have a particular store or the most top 10 purchased items. Now, of course, if 1,000 people are visiting that every minute, the top 10 is not really going to change all that much. And there's no point pulling that information from a database, right? Because the top 10 doesn't change all that frequently, yet forget, you're always, when somebody's visiting the website, they're always making that query to the database. Hey, what are the top 10 products that are being sold? So what you can do is you can cache that, and that's what Elasticache does. It's a way of caching your most common web queries. So when your web servers are getting a request, they'll go to Elasticache first and get that information from Elasticache, and it takes a huge load off of your databases. And you're going to get a whole bunch of scenario questions in your Solutions Architect Associate exam where your database is overloaded, and it's going to ask you what is an option to help with this. And of course, using Elasticache is one option. You could also use read replicas. And again, we're going to cover this in more detail in this section of the course. Elasticache consists of two different engines. So we've got Memcached, and then we've got Redis. And we will learn about the differences later on in this course. So what are my exam tips? Just remember that RDS consists of online transaction processing, comes in 6 different flavors, so SQL Server, MySQL, PostgreSQL, Oracle, Aurora, and MariaDB. DynamoDB is Amazon's NoSQL solution. Redshift is Amazon's data warehousing solution. This is done for online analytics processing. You then got Elasticache, which comes in 2 different flavors, so Memcached and Redis, and this is Amazon's caching solution. And just remember that Redshift is used for business intelligence or for data warehousing, and Elasticache is used to speed up the performance of existing databases. So it's a way of caching frequently identical queries. So as always, the best way to learn something about AWS is to go in and get our hands dirty. So in the next lecture, we're going to go in and create our very first RDS database, and we're going to install WordPress to it. So if you've got the time, please join me in the next lecture. Thank you.